again, and welcome to this episode in our voyage around the 20th century in music and in choral music in particular. I've called this episode Anything Goes, and it's because by the 20th century, composers felt that everything had been done with tonality that could possibly be done, and they were looking to experiment with other ideas. If you watched the last episode, you will have heard me talk about all the isms and experiments, the different ways that composers responded to music in ways that were quite different from the general trend that we looked at through the previous centuries. And you might recall that I mentioned in particular the Tristan chord from Wagner's great opera drama, Tristan and Isolde. And I touched on the fact that this very chord seemed to be a turning point for so many composers and made them feel that you couldn't go any further with chromaticism or tonality. Let me take you back to that Tristan chord for a moment and explore it a little bit further. I think it's interesting to see why something like a single chord in a piece can have such an amazing impact on what follows. The opening is absolutely rootless. We've got no sense of which note is do. We've no sense of where this is going. To try to demonstrate, I'm going to give 3 different places to take this opening. Peter told us in previous episode about how you could use certain chords as pivots that take you off into quite a different direction. It's a bit like one of those turntables that they put engines on to send them off back in a different direction down the tracks. And a pivot chord in music is what turns us from one direction to another. It's another way of thinking about it is when you're driving and perhaps you come to a roundabout, and if you take one turning, you might go off to, I don't know, London. If you take a different turning, it might take you off down to Brighton. And it's taking you on quite a different journey. And at that point on the roundabout, you don't know which journey the composer's going to take you on. We'll see as we go into the 20th century that some composers will even stop that sense of a journey. You don't gradually arrive in the city or gradually arrive at the coast. Sometimes they will chuck you there so rapidly that you think, whoa, how did that happen? How did I get here? And that's a part of the excitement of what happens next musically. So, going back to this Tristan chord, here are 3 different possible routes that we could take from that one chord simply by changing something in the pivot to kick us off into a new direction. So you'll see I've put the pivot chord in red on these examples, and I'm showing you just with chord symbols a rough idea of where I've taken each one. Of course, Wagner didn't do any of these. He repeats this rootless idea. He takes it higher, he takes it longer, he puts it into different instruments. We reach a point where we really have no idea where we might be going with this, where we are. It's just an emotional whirlpool. Then he delivers this extraordinary resolution onto a chord finally. And it just makes us shudder, however many times we've heard it. Have a listen. So that's why composers started looking for other ways in which to express themselves musically. You have these different isms that I mentioned before, things like serialism, neoclassicism. If you want an ism for the category that we're going to look at in this episode, I suppose modernism would be the best description for it. But I prefer to call it the I'm not sure I'm going to like this category, or the I think this is going to be too hard category. Many choirs get this feeling when they're presented with a piece of 20th century music that doesn't immediately have the obvious melody and harmony that we've been so accustomed to. I sang in a very good chamber choir for many years, and we would often feel when we were presented with a new piece in an unfamiliar style, oh, this is going to be too hard. Will we get it ready in time? Don't understand this, don't think we're going to like it. But whenever we got to the concert, and in the context of what the conductor had planned, it suddenly in performance made sense and was very enjoyable, very rewarding. So I think there is an element in choirs where we need to trust the conductor and the programme builder that there's some method in their madness and be prepared to go with the flow. On the whole, conductors have a lot more to lose from a bad performance than the choir does. And so they're not really going to choose a piece that is way beyond the choir's abilities. So there should be a bit of confidence from the choir members. But I think As conductors, we also have more responsibility probably to explain at an earlier stage, what's the piece about? How does it fit into the programme? Why have we chosen it? Why is it worth that extra bit of effort to learn it and bring it to performance? And we probably don't do that quite enough. We wait for the choir to read the programme notes and they suddenly think, oh, now I get it. So things for us all to do when it comes to pieces in a more modern and less familiar style. In the Kemmersing Singers, we've sung lots of pieces in this category. We've sung Benjamin Britten's Ceremony of Carols, Celia McDowell, A Fancy of Folk Songs. We've sung pieces by Morton Lauridsen, Dale Warland, any number of composers writing currently and in a recent past, whose music is unutterably wonderful, but can seem a little bit daunting at first to learn. Let's just remind ourselves of a few of those pieces and remember just how beautiful they are. What is it that makes these pieces trickier for us than for, if you like, more traditional pieces? Well, let's take rhythm first of all. And in the 20th century, composers experiment much more with rhythm than they did in the past. And you start to get, yes, more technical expressions. You get polyrhythms, polymetric, syncopation. They're the main ones, I suppose. And I can briefly illustrate what those are in layman's terms. So let's take polyrhythms first of all. Poly, many, rhythms we know. So polyrhythms simply means layering up rhythms that really don't quite sit together. A simple little percussion example where you can see that there are single beats, double beats, what we call small triplets, one beat divided into three, and what we sometimes call big triplets, which is where you have to fit 3 notes into the space that 2 would normally take up. So that's polyrhythms. Now, polymeters, polymetric, is actually not an expression that we use as commonly, but we meet it a lot. This is where music is written in lots of different time signatures. You might have 2 different players or 2 different singers actually with different time signatures at the same time, and it eventually works itself out over the course of several bars. Equally, we're very familiar in choir music, in choral music, with music that changes time signature quite a lot. Here's a little example from Bernstein's West Side Story that's very familiar to us. First of all, this is written out with just the same time signature all the time, but the meter of it, the way the beats are divided up, is clearly quite different. Just remind yourselves of this one. And now I can show it to you written out as if it was in its different time signatures, and you'll see how 6/8, 2 lots of 3, varies with 3/4 time, 3 lots of 2. Finally, syncopation, and that's probably the most familiar one to everybody. Syncopation is so widely used in jazz music, apart from anything else. And this is where the accent or the emphasis is deliberately moved away from what's normally a strong beat onto what is normally a weak beat or a weak part of the beat. Here's an example, I Got Rhythm by Gershwin. And you hear it first of all written out with the notes absolutely on the beat, 4/4 accompaniment. And then it's written out and played as it is by Gershwin, with most of the notes actually shifted onto weak quavers, weak parts of the beat. And it feels and sounds quite different, even though technically the rate of the notes is pretty much the same. This is syncopation. The next difficulty can be pitching the right notes. The intervals and harmonies are often not as predictable as they have been perhaps in previous centuries, and learning something by ear or memorising it, if you're not a strong reader, can be more difficult. It needs more patience and more reinforcement in rehearsal. It's far easier to learn the right notes to start with than to spend time undoing wrong notes. Peter is going to give us some helpful tips on how to tackle some slightly less familiar intervals and take a deeper look at the sound world of John Tavener.
It was John Tavener's cantata, The Whale, that first brought him to prominence at the age of 24 in 1968. Following the premiere of this work, Tavener was variously described as, quote, the musical discovery of the year, unquote, and as being, quote, among the very best creative talents of his generation, unquote. During his career, he became one of the best known and popular composers of his generation, most particularly for The Protecting Veil and Song for Athene, which was sung at the funeral of Princess Diana. After his conversion to the Russian Orthodox Church in 1977, Tavener's compositions were majorly influenced by Orthodox theology and liturgical traditions. He was especially drawn to the mystic aspects of the faith, setting to music some of the writings of the Church Fathers. The style of Tavener's earliest music shows the influence of composers such as Igor Stravinsky and Olivier Messiaen. Later, however, his style became more sparse, making use of sounds in widely spaced registers, and writing most commonly in a diatonically tonal musical language. None of that shifting around by semitones that Sarah has introduced us to in previous sessions. Tavener recognised Arvo Pärt as a kindred spirit, sharing with him a common religious tradition and a love of transparent musical textures. In the light of this, I'm going to consider some pieces in addition to Tavener's The Lamb, which are similar in their musical language. My explorations take as their starting point the fairly common and completely understandable reaction that is encountered when choir members are introduced to music in a style that is outside their comfort zone. I was going to say when choirs are confronted with, but that sounds a bit too adversarial. What factors in the various contemporary pieces that the Kemsing singers have undertaken in recent years, pieces such as Dale Warland's Nativity Suite, the folk song arrangements by Celia MacDowell, and Britain's A Ceremony of Carols, might produce the reaction just mentioned? Challenges of rhythm could well be one, but I want to start with two even more frequently encountered difficulties. Firstly, that of the music sounding odd or just plain wrong, because of the way the composer combines notes to make odd-sounding harmonies. Secondly, the difficulty of pitching the notes of a melodic line because of its angularity, by which I mean the way a melody can jump from one note to a less than expected sequel. Let's take the soprano's opening melody from Tavener's The Lamb and consider some potential difficulties. Bars 3 and 4 are the first to present difficulties of pitching. The reason can be explained by looking at the musical illustration coming up on your screen. What we have here is a sequence of notes which, if split up into two separate groups as shown by the square brackets, present no problem, especially not the second one. The first group, the jump from F sharp to E flat, will be familiar to anyone who knows G minor scale, which you can see written out in full. Let's hear it played in ascending order first, and then just notes 8, 7 and 6. 8, 7, 6. For the purpose of private practice, if you have a keyboard, you could play the G, note 8, and then try singing notes 7, 6, 7 a few times. 7, 6, 7, 8, 8, 7, 6. The second sequence of notes, E flat, F, A flat, would present no problems if we were to meet it in the context of the song She'll Be Coming Round the Mountain When She Comes, or in the Wombles song Overground, Underground, Wombling Free. She'll be coming round the mountain, she'll be coming round the mountain, overground, underground, wombling free. The challenge comes when the two little groups of notes follow one another, with the E flat first being approached from F sharp but quitted by F natural, and then approached from F natural but quitted by F sharp. F sharp, E flat, F natural, F natural, E flat, F sharp. Let me play that again. Etc. This is slightly tricky, but not impossible, especially if you've warmed up on the introductory exercises I've suggested. The third bracketed group of notes, labelled dim 7th on the sheet, is not especially problematic, and I'm suggesting a 3-step approach to practicing it. Step 1 is to sing up and down a dominant 7th chord, as illustrated at the foot of the page. La 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 la. That's step 1. Step 2 is to raise the starting note from D natural to E flat. Written here as D sharp, but it's the same pitch. That's a D. La 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 la. Step 3 is to lower the uppermost note from C down to B. C down to B, which gives us the sequence that Tavener wrote. My illustration doesn't show the final G, but you'll hear it in the demonstration of the whole sequence that now follows. So much for awkward melody notes, everything about which, by the way, applies to the tenors and basses later in the piece. What about those places where the combination of two or more notes sounds, if not plain wrong, then certainly unfamiliar and disconcerting, and what's more, present us with the challenge of pitching and hanging on to our notes in the face of opposition from another voice part? We only have to wait for the entry of the altos in bar 4, and then again in bars 5 and 6, to be confronted with some example. Here's what's happening in bar 2. The first two intervals, B natural against E flat and A natural against F natural, are in themselves completely conventional, especially if E flat gets written in its other form of D sharp. D sharp and B combine to form a minor sixth, and F and A to form a major third. As stand-alone intervals, there's nothing remarkable about them. So why do the very first two harmonies in this piece on the words "thou know" sound a little bit strange? Well, it's all to do with the context, and what our ears have been led to believe by the melody in bar 1. With nothing to go on but the single notes of the melody, most people will reckon we're listening to a tune in G major. It starts on G, it's got those strange notes in between, but it finishes on G. We've got the G being approached by F sharp, the 7th note of the scale. Voilà, mes amis, as Hercule Poirot might say. The little grey cells tell me we are in the G major, n'est-ce pas? So with our ears calibrated to G major as home, the introduction of E flats and F naturals in bar 2 immediately calls into question, however, whether G really is home. Though this appears to be confirmed by both sopranos and altos meeting back on a unison G natural, approaching the note from a semitone above, the altos, and from a semitone below, the sopranos. This little passage of two-part harmony is like a pincer movement, the two parts converging by ever narrowing intervals. I want briefly to return to the issue of the phenomenon of our ears having the capacity to hear sequences of single notes as belonging to, or most likely belonging to, one particular scale or key. I cited bar 1 of the Lamb as strongly suggesting G major, hence the slightly odd effect of the harmonies in bar 2. But truth to tell, the notes of bar 1 are ambiguous, because as well as being notes numbers 1, 2, 3 and 7 of G major, they could equally well be numbers 2, 3, 4 and 5 of E minor, as shown in the next illustration. Staying with the issue of key or tonality, it is intriguing to reflect on the thought processes that may have been in Tavener's mind as he pondered the implications of the harmonies he found himself writing. When the tenors and basses eventually join, the music is firmly cast in a form of E minor, but with a modal feel because of the absence of D sharps, the raised 7th of the true minor scale. Did the sound of the E flats suggest D sharps to Tavener, thus leading him to cast the 4-part harmony section in the form of E minor? Or was that always his intention before even writing the first and therefore possibly deliberately ambiguous opening bar? Let's listen twice to the 4 bars where the tenors and basses first sing, once with me using D sharps and once with Tavener's D naturals. I hope you can appreciate their slightly old world effect, very much in keeping with the spirit and atmosphere of orthodox chant. The D G sharps have got arrows pointing to them. Tenors, altos. And now the version that Tavener actually wrote. D natural in the alto, and in the tenor, D natural as well. I thought I would finish by taking a quick look at two pieces by composers whose style is not dissimilar to Tavener's. The pieces providing further illustration of either tricky combinations of notes or the exploration of unexpected changes of key. The first piece is by Arvo Pärt, whom Tavener regarded as a kindred spirit. Entitled Solfeggio, the piece dates from 1963 or 64, when Pärt was writing in a severely atonal style. That means not in any particular key. Taking the notes of the C major scale, the composer introduces them one by one in successive voice parts, but varying the sequence of entries. The following music example will show what the score both looks and sounds like. Everything is rigorously controlled. Note lengths, all the same, dynamics, and especially which voice part enters next in order to produce the precise sonority desired. The challenge of singing music like this is obvious. Your next note may well be the next note in the rising scale, but can you pitch it and then sustain it against what you might feel is the opposition? This example is, of course, much more dissonant than anything we find in later Tavener, but the technique of combining adjacent notes can be thought of as having its origin here. The piece I've chosen to illustrate what I'm calling visits to unexpected keys is by the Estonian composer Veljo Toomis, who died in 2017. The extract comes from number 2 of 4 Estonian lullabies, entitled It's Time for the Little Berry to Sleep. And the tonal unexpectedness arises from the way the composer treats the 4th and 7th notes, D natural and G sharp, of the home scale A minor. Every time G sharp appears in the basses, there is always a D sharp, not D natural, in the alto part, making the harmony most frequently into a chord of G sharp minor, a key with only the remotest connection to the home key of A minor. In the closing 8 bars, which we will now see and hear, there is the most delicious exploitation of the difference between G sharp minor and G major. Finishing on G major, the music is left hovering in a harmonic limbo. may I conclude by encouraging those of you who are fans of Arvo Pärt to explore pieces by Veljo Tormis, who was an iconic figure in the singing revolution that alerted most of the rest of the world to the rich musical traditions of the Baltic republics.
Well, that Tavener piece is just gorgeous, isn't it? Thank you, Peter, for that. The third aspect of modernism that can make things a bit tricky is the different techniques that are required. Here's a topical little clip that might amuse you that sets this section up for us. That's brilliant. Now, there are some really precise instructions in here, like rubato and chloroxissimo, and they, of course, are jokes. But also within this is an illustration of the point that modern ideas yield modern ways of writing things. And you've got little note clusters there, you've got lots of tempo changes, little gaps introduced, changes of time signature. It's all there, isn't it? All of these things can present challenges, especially for amateur performers. Add to this requirements to slide, to whisper, to speak. It means we have to use our voices differently, and that takes a bit of getting used to. Let's take a look at Leonard Bernstein's Best of All Possible Worlds from his operetta Candide. And even in the short arrangement of this that we have, it requires quite a lot from us to bring out the amusement and the balminess of this piece. Candide is a satirical novella written by Voltaire in 1759. And just to give you a bit of context, that is, of course, the year that Mozart died. So this was written in the period, the Age of Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, or the classical period, as we call it in music. He takes a pop at religion, at armies, at philosophers, at moralists. Now, Bernstein was a wide-ranging and free-thinking man of many parts, and he was delighted when he was approached by Lillian Hellman, the American playwright, in 1953 with a view to making Candide into a musical theatre piece. Voltaire's work was a satirical portrayal of the Catholic Church and its hypocrisy and violence at the time. And they both saw parallels with what was going on in the United States with the House's Un-American Activities Committee and some of its Inquisition-like techniques that it was using. So what's it about? Well, the young Candide is an idealist and believes absolutely what his mentor, his tutor, Dr. Pangloss, tells him. And essentially, this is the philosophical idea of Leibniz, that everything is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. And the argument goes like this. If God is all-powerful and all-knowing, then he wouldn't choose to create an imperfect world. We know that this world has imperfections, and therefore we have to conclude that God chose this as the optimal world among all other worlds that he looked at and all other options that he looked at. This was the best of all those possible worlds. And of course, philosophically, this can be used as an excuse for, as an explanation of any and all imperfections in the world. As Candide goes out into the world, he learns and experiences more and more things that undermine this theory of optimism. Let's hear our chorus performed as it was originally performed on stage. Dr. Pangloss is explaining to Candide, to his fiancée Cunegonde, and to the other students and servants around him, how, despite their objections, all's for the best in the best of all possible worlds.
Dr. Pangloss is the greatest philosopher in the world.
Let us review lesson 11.
Paragraph 2.
Axiom 7.
Once one dismisses the rest of all possible worlds, one finds that this is the best of all possible worlds.
Once one dismisses the rest of all possible worlds, one finds that this is the best of all possible worlds.
Pray classify pigeons and camels.
Pigeons can fly.
Camels are mammals.
There is a reason for everything under the sun.
There is a season for everything under the sun.
Objection! What about snakes?
Snakes. 'Twas snake that tempted Mother Eve. Because of snake we now believe that though depraved we can be saved from hellfire and damnation.
Because of snake's temptation.
If snake had not seduced our lot and primed us for salvation, Jehovah could not pardon all the sins that we call cardinal, involving bed and bottle. Now on to Aristotle. Mankind is one, all men are brothers.
As you have done, do unto others.
It's understood in this best of all possible worlds.
All's for the good in this best of all possible worlds.
Objection! What about war?
War. Though war may seem a bloody curse, it is a blessing in reverse. When cannon roar, both rich and poor by danger are united.
Till every wrong is righted.
Philosophers make evident the point that I have cited. 'Tis war makes equal, as it were, the noble and the commoner. Thus war improves relations.
Now on to conjugations.
Amo, amos, amant, amamus.
Amo, amas, amat, amamus.
Proving that this is the best of all possible worlds.
Love and kisses, the best of all possible worlds.
Quod erat demonstrandum,
Quod erat
needs be.
Quod erat demonstrandum.
Quod erat
Quod erat demonstrandum in this best of all possible worlds. Quod erat demonstrandum. Kill me.
So let's look at a little bit of the detail of our four-part arrangement by Robert Page. And the first thing that we start off with is a syncopation, and the women appear to imitate the men. But let's look more closely. The men have a little gap, a rest in theirs. Let us review, to emphasise the spikiness of it. Over the page, the women come in, they don't have the rest, they have a longer note, which gives a smoother, more feminine response to the spikiness of the men's. And it's important little details like this that matter. Let's just listen to that bit. On the next stave down, we go into the main idea of this melodically. The little rests come back, and we've got a polymetric bit. We've got 2 bars of 4/4, 2 bars of 3/4, and a bar of 2/4. It's very important to get that distinction. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, bum, bim, bum, 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 bum. You've got to be on the ball there with the tempo, otherwise you get left behind. This idea is repeated higher. Once one dismisses the rest of all possible worlds, and then over the page it goes right up high, which is quite tricky to keep a good vocal tone up there on. One finds that this is the best, and there's another long note tucked in there to emphasize that. One finds that this is the best of all possible worlds. Then we move into the next verse, as it were. Pray classify pigeons and camels. And here's the first little technical thing we've got to do. We've got to slide down from that top chord on fly. And we just got to let our voices go. Fly, fly. It doesn't matter where you land. You just fall away from it. Camels are mammals. And then this same answering phrase, there is a reason for everything under the sun. The next little tricky bit usually is getting in this leaping objection, and it really has got to come in as quite a sudden thing. It's that rising seventh, an awkward interval at the best of times. It's got to be hit fortissimo. And the women have got to be able to respond to it immediately. And it's this little conversational bit, objection. Oh, what about snakes? So we've got to come up with a reason why snakes are still the best thing you can have in the best of all possible worlds. And so they come up with this idea that, well, snake tempted Eve. If that hadn't happened, we wouldn't have the concept of pardoning sins and making things better and being saved from damnation. So, of course, snakes are good as well. And this has got to be done so clearly to get all these words across. By the time we get to page 10, we've got some extra harmony in there, really loud, to give it a lot of emphasis, from hellfire and damnation. And you've got to be prepared to let go and let rip on things like that. Otherwise, they just sound a bit limp to the audience. So while those of us that enjoy singing in choirs quite like the sense of being able to hide a bit among the troops, these are places where we've really got to be prepared to step out on stage, as it were, and really present as an actor would, and overdo these kind of statements. On the next page, we have another little detail that again provides a little technical difficulty for our voices. I'm on page 11 now. And the ladies are asked to go into short staccato notes with their melody. And it can be more tricky on the voice to get the words across. Jehovah could not pardon all the sins that we call cardinal, involving bed and bottle. You've got to nip, 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 and try and get some tone out of it. And while they're doing that, the men are sounding terribly pious. And this is a pop at religion and theologians and things, isn't it? Amen, amen, amen. And we get those two conflicting ideas going on. The next bit of difference here is down on the bottom of page 14 and into page 15, where the men and if you're not familiar with this notation, you wouldn't necessarily know it. You've got note heads there, but they're little crosses, and the implication is that this is spoken rather than sung, but possibly spoken in a slightly sing-song way, because why else give note heads to it? So for the men, they've got to sound reasonably convincing. Well, it seems to me, though war may seem a bloody curse, though war may seem a bloody curse, your voice still does seem to move a little bit with that same melodic shape. But you're just emphasising it as spoken words. It is a blessing in reverse. Still a bit of up and down. And then they go back into melody, so you've got to be ready for that as well. Our next challenge is on page 17, when it goes into this slower waltz theme when they're practicing their Latin. Amo amas, amat amamos, amo amas, amat amamos. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. And then straight back into the other one. Bum 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 bum, leading into the big finish of all the crossing over of Q, E, D. We've proved it, quod erat demonstrandum. And then the gorgeous bit right at the end, where all the parts in this arrangement, it's not there in the original stage version, is it? But it's a wonderful bit to do, where you hit a chord and you slowly, slowly, slowly glide up to your top chord. And it really is a magnificent ending. So let's hear, and by all means sing along with, this choral arrangement.
Let us review lesson 11. Paragraph 2, axiom 7. Once one dismisses the best of all possible worlds, one finds that this is the best of all possible worlds. Once one dismisses the rest of all possible worlds, one finds that this is the best of all possible worlds. Pray classify pigeons and camels. Pigeons can fly, camels are mammals. There is a reason for everything under the sun. There is a reason for everything under the sun. Objection! What about snakes? Well, let me see. 'Twas snake that tempted Mother Eve. Because of snake we now believe that though depraved we can be saved from hellfire and damnation. Because of snake's temptation, the snake had not seduced our lot and bribed us for salvation. Amen, 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 amen. Involving bed and bottle. Now on to Aristotle. Okay. Mankind is one, all men are brothers, as you have done to one to others. It's understood in this best of all possible worlds. There's love and good in the best of all possible worlds. Objection! Yes, what about war? Well, it seems to me, though war may seem a bloody curse, it is a blessing in reverse. When cannons were both rich and poor by danger are united, till every wrong is righted. Yes! Thus at first there's evident the strength that I have cited. The drum, the drum, the rumble and the drum, the sword improves relations. Now on to conjugations. Q-E-D